Welcome to the Think Factory podcast. We got one question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Welcome back to the Think Factory podcast, powered by OGC Solutions. I'm Chris Santomassimo, one of the hosts, but I'm joined today by my co-host, Alka Bahal, who's one of the partners at our firm.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for having me on.
Well, I think this is a great time to really spotlight what you've been an expert in for a really long time, and that is corporate immigration services. Because, immigration has been a big hot button issue leading up to the election and even post-election in November, because it's really been a topic on the minds of virtually everybody around the country, no matter which side of the aisle you might find yourself in. A lot of the news, especially when you talk about comments from President-elect Trump and his appointed borders speak to some of the societal issues. But what we're here to talk about is what is the impact on companies and their workforces, because I think that's something that really should be front of mind for companies.
You're absolutely right, Chris. I think a lot of businesses don't think that the current topics in immigration affect them, and I think they really do. Obviously, the incoming administration has been very vocal about many of its immigration plans, which are typically, more vocally centered around removing illegal aliens from the United States. So that's anyone who's here without a valid visa status. Could be people who crossed the border, could be people who overstayed. These are all individuals that would be considered illegal. Most employers will take the position that, well, that doesn't affect me because I don't have any illegal workers, or if I do, I don't know about them, and it's not going to impact me in a substantial way. And I think that that is a mistake, because there is a lot more to the incoming administration's plans for immigration, far beyond just removing illegal aliens. I think that's one of the hot topics, if you will, that gets people's attention. And most people can get on board with that because they're illegal. They've crossed the border, and so most people think that they've done something wrong. It's okay then to expel them. It goes a lot deeper and more complicated than that, but we're not going to get into that today. But employers need to be aware that this is really a sign of the incoming administration's tightening on immigration all across the board. That's going to mean more enforcement, stricter application of policies, narrowing of interpretations, and visa processing guidelines. So if you are an employer who does sponsor foreign nationals, you need to be prepared for more scrutiny, longer processing times, perhaps even more difficult to get visas that we may have received pretty easily in the past. Even if we're looking for an extension, it's something that hasn't changed in the last 3 years. With the mindset of the people who adjudicate the petitions changing, the processing is definitely going to change. So that's one thing those employers need to be aware of. Something all employers need to be aware of is the increase to enforcement. Obviously, a big thing in the Trump administration is going to be an enforcement issue in the immigration arena. That goes hand in hand with wanting to remove all the illegal aliens, but it also means enforcement in the context of what we would call legitimate immigration. So enforcement will include everything related to I-9 compliance, meaning if you're an employer, you do a Form I-9 for every employee. I call this the most complicated one-page form the federal government issues, because there are so many nuances and so many ways to make mistakes, either in the process of executing it or in the form itself, that can subject an employer to liability. And the sort of unique thing about the Form I-9 is you're doing it for every employee, and you have to keep them for certain employees that you've terminated, right, for a certain period of time. Therefore, if you have a high turnover, you have possibly an HR person who's making the same mistake in all of your I-9s, you have this exponential liability sitting in your records. And ICE has traditionally been pretty unsympathetic to things that we may think are a typographical error. They view as a substantive error, and they will fine you for them. I don't expect that to get any better under Trump. If anything, it's going to be more strict, less room for negotiation. So the best thing to do there, if you're an employer with any number of employees is to check your records, look at them now before the government comes knocking, and make sure they're compliant.
Well, and during COVID too, there was a relaxation about completion of I-9, the requirements in terms of remote verification, for example. But once those relaxation rules expired, employers were supposed to go back and do it the traditional way, and I think a lot of employers have not.
Exactly. You're absolutely right. I've encountered many, many clients who've had that problem. A fundamental misunderstanding about what that flexibility was, which allowed to I-9 somebody remotely without having to see their documents in person. It was a necessity, right? During COVID, you couldn't get together. That particular set of rules, or relaxation of the rules, I should say, was very liberal. You could get the person's documents via fax, email, video, like whatever worked to keep the business afloat. When that ended, one of the back end requirements, punishment, if you will, was that you needed to meet with the employee and see those documents in original and update the I-9 record. And so many clients just missed this, didn't realize. And then at the same time, when they ended those flexibilities, they put into place a now remote verification procedure. However, that procedure is completely different than the flexibility that was in place during COVID. Under the current procedures, you have to follow a very strict set of steps in order to I-9 somebody remotely. Those steps include things like having them fill out Section 1 in advance, getting a copy of the documents that they will present in advance, doing a video interview, seeing those those actual documents, and then updating the I-9. So completely different than the flexibility process. Again, a lot of clients have missed that. A lot of employers don't realize the flexibility was one thing and the remote verification is something else entirely.
Are employers required to record those remote video sessions?
They are not. They're not required to record them, but it does have to be a live video interaction.
And there has to be a verification by the employer representative.
Correct. Again, a lot of times employers miss the fact that the signing of the Form I-9 is actually an attestation under penalty of perjury. So it's really not a process employers should take lightly. They should be serious about it. They should be paying attention. It's one of those onboarding processes that people like to zoom through because, it's just another set of paperwork you've got to get done. But it is really something employers need to spend some time and attention on and make sure that they're getting the right knowledge and information so they can do it expeditiously without violations.
Yeah, and I've seen a number of our clients that have sort of automated the application and onboarding processes, with either through a PEO or through their HRIS system that's connected with their payroll, where you've got this sort of life cycle from application to hire and then onboarding, and it's all done within a system. But this is something that really sits outside that system, so you can't automate this piece of it, and I think that's one thing that a lot of employers miss.
You're absolutely right, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's certainly something that many employers don't realize is that the vast majority of the electronic systems that are out there, including those built into some of the most well-known and largest HRIS platforms or payroll systems, do not follow the law. So they're trying to automate this process, the Form I-9 process, just like they might be trying to automate the rest of the onboarding or an employment application process. But it doesn't lend itself well to that because of these strict requirements in terms of having a video interaction or seeing the individual's documents in person. I've encountered a lot of clients where the electronic system has the foreign national employee, or the employee, I should say, upload their documents into a system, which then pushes it to the manager's side, right, at the company, and the company person is looking at those documents in the computer. And that is a violation of the procedure. You're not viewing the original documents. It doesn't follow the remote verification procedure because there's no live video interaction, and it doesn't follow the regular procedure because you've not seen those original documents in your hands. I have had clients who've been inspected by the government with I-9 systems, electronic systems of this nature, and the federal government takes the position that these I-9s are executed improperly, and it's the same as not having an I-9. So for example, I've had a client that had electronic system A for about 3 years and switched to electronic system B. And that was what they had at the time they were being inspected. We looked at electronic system B, and it was sufficient. It was compliant, and there was a component where they were meeting with the employees in person. But electronic system A was not compliant, and we would receive no correspondence, no communication, nothing we needed from company A. They just didn't provide us any of the documents regarding the security, how documents were being saved, copies of our old records, nothing. As a result, all of the I-9s that were completed in the system A were considered violating the law, and therefore the company was fined for them. And it was 350 I-9s out of 600 I-9s that they had. So it was a huge penalty to the company. The company didn't have 1,200 employees, but it had so much turnover because it was a staffing company. And that was a big problem, and clients don't know about it because there's not enough information out there. And some of these big name companies are selling it to you like it helps your process. Clients don't think to look at to see if it's legal or not. So it's one of the services we actually offer is we look at some of these systems, how it's built into or customized for your HR, for the client's HRIS system to see, is it compliant, and then we work with the vendor to change it to make sure that it does follow the right procedures.
Very, very important, especially when you talk about penalties on a per I-9 basis as well.
Exactly. And those penalties could be as low as, $300 per I-9, which hardly ever happens. That's only if you have a 10% or less error rate, to almost 3,000 or 2,500 per I-9. And that's if you have a 50% or more rate. And I can tell you from experience, when I meet with a client to look at their I-9s, and the feedback I'm getting from the client is, oh, we know what we're doing. We pay attention. We're careful with our I-9s. I typically find about a 35% error rate. And if the client is anything less than thinking that they're fully compliant, the error rate goes up from there.
It's crazy when you think about how the penalties will mount.
Exactly. Exactly. They can really layer on exponentially. And then on top of what we'll call the standard penalties, the federal government can apply enhancements, which are an increment of in 5% about whether you're a large size business, whether you're sophisticated enough that you really should have known about this, if you have any illegal employees, if you're certain size, have you been inspected in the past? And of course, they're called enhancement and mitigation factors, and good faith is one. But of course, the government will only apply them for enhancement, and we use them only for the defense and mitigation.
Of course. Well, speaking of I-9s, I think the next topic that I think about next is really the E-Verify system. Talk a little bit about what you've heard in terms of the requirements to use E-Verify and how that interacts with some state laws that frankly are a little troubling to me, to the extent that they really conflict with federal law in some pretty material ways.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Chris. So there's certainly a trend in the federal government, absent current, the incoming administration, to encourage the use of E-Verify. In fact, with this new, we'll call it new, it's relatively new, remote verification procedure, you're only eligible to use it if you are enrolled in E-Verify. I know also in my dealings with the federal government and the information that's coming out, they are putting a lot of time and effort into an E-Verify system to improve it, to smooth the process. There's a new E-Verify Plus system coming out, which should offer some enhancements. That's still in a pilot program, and we haven't really seen how that's going to benefit employers. But what we see from that is this trend towards implementing E-Verify. And you're right, a lot of states prefer, for whatever reason, to discourage the use of E-Verify and have implemented state laws prohibiting the use of E-Verify in employment. Again, the incoming administration is all about enforcement, and I think that there has been sort of this direct trend towards making E-Verify mandatory at a federal level. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that's going to play out in those states where they've prohibited it as a matter of state law. It's going to now become federal, mandatory as a matter of federal law, and we're going to have this push pull again. And I think it's only one of many push pulls we will have over immigration between states and the federal government, similar to where we are with the marijuana laws, right? Still illegal on a federal level, but many states have permitted its use. I think this whole issue of the state versus federal will really come to a head in 2025 and beyond in the realm of immigration, also related, to the deportation of illegal aliens. You've got sanctuary states who want to keep the illegal aliens and keep them safe, and you're going to have this federal interest in locating them and moving them out of the country. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but it will be interesting.
Yeah, I think about a preemption argument on some of these, and I wonder if that carries the day to basically, tip the scales in favor of the federal government on this issue.
I would think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I would think so, right? We always learn the fundamental tenet is federal law trumps state law.
Right. Where there's a constitutional basis.
Right.
On the marijuana issue, the states that have legalized it have basically made it an intrastate activity. So if it's intrastate and it only impacts intrastate commerce, then the feds can't regulate it. On the other hand, when you talk about anything that crosses state lines, or that involves immigration, which is solely a federal function,
exactly.
But how exactly this relates to those solely federal functions is going to be interesting to see how it turns out.
Yeah,
so, for sure.
It's going to be interesting.
I think if I had to put down a marker, I'd probably say the feds win on this one. But to your point, it's going to be a long slog before we get some court decisions on it.
Mm-hmm. I'm inclined to agree with you, but yeah, it's going to be a lot of court cases.
No doubt. Yeah, just like over the last decade, I think we're going to see a lot of litigation activity over it.
Absolutely.
And pretty soon as well.
Absolutely. I think right from the get-go. So, I mean, one of the things we talk about a lot right now in the immigration and attorney arena is what will or what could Trump implement on day one. Obviously, he and his groups have been planning for a long time. And so there's no reason to think that when they take over on January 20th, that they aren't going to be able to immediately implement a number of things. So, we're all kind of bracing for that, and we're putting things into categories. Here's what we think could happen right away. Here are things that we think require regulatory change. I certainly think he'll be looking at making changes across the board right away, as well as making regulatory changes. But what they actually end up being, it's hard to say, right? There's been some flip-flopping. There's been some, want to do this, then backing off on it. So it's certainly going to be a sort of a dynamic, constantly moving, evolving thing.
Well, one of the changes that I think is interesting, or one of the variations from prior incoming administrations, is the level of specificity that I've heard on the issue. Like even today, Tom Homan, the appointed border czar, was quoted to say that he's specifically going to start some of these broad, expulsion activities in Illinois. I mean, he was very specific to put it down, and I think we'll see some boots on the ground on the 20th or the 21st in Chicago.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
I think you're right.
He's accurate.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by this planning. There's some really specific, concrete, plans in place that they can execute quickly and. Literally, the moment he takes the oath, he's going to pull the trigger, go do this.
Exactly. So what do you think, besides the I-9 compliance issue, which I think should be top of mind for every employer, what are some of the other things that companies can do to get prepared?
So an interesting thing is that there are a couple of types of visas or statuses that are out there that we think could possibly go away under Trump. So that could be, for example, TPS, temporary protected status, which affects a few million foreign nationals in the U.S. and gives them work authorization. This could affect employers because if that goes away immediately on 1/21, there's a question: does their work authorization still stay in effect through whatever the validity on their cards is? Or does it go away immediately? That's the first question. And in either case, how is that going to affect you as an employer? Again, you're going to lose a piece of your workforce. Another example would be the H-4 EAD, or Employment Authorization Document. So the H-1B visa is a visa most people know about. Professional worker visa. Individuals who come to the U.S. on the H-1B visa bring their spouses and children on H-4 visas. Individuals who have been here for a very long period of time and are waiting to go through their green card process, once they've reached a certain stage of being here long enough, their spouses can get a work authorization document. That's the H-4 EAD. Trump has been very vocal about saying he doesn't want that to be a visa anymore. He wants it to go away. So if he eliminates that visa, and if I'm not mistaken, there's between just under 2 million people in the U.S. who are work authorized, and that's another hit to the American workforce. The individuals who are on H-4 EADs, they may not be professionals, they may not be our engineers and architects, some may be, but they're still a big part of the American workforce. So now you're talking about taking several million people out of the workforce very quickly. That can certainly affect you as an employer. And then also thinking about his plan to remove the foreign national illegal who are not here with status, that could affect your workforce even if those individuals are not your employees, because you don't necessarily know who your employee has at home. If they have a family member who is here unlawfully, and we see that all the time, you've got U.S. citizen children who are grown up, have jobs, and they still have parents at home who are unlawful. That could affect your workforce, because if those individuals then aren't deported, it's going to affect the family dynamic. Your employee may leave. So I think that there's a lot of indirect fallout that's going to follow from a lot of the plans that Trump will be putting into place.
It's a great point, because a company that thinks they're doing all the right things, from I-9 compliance to E-Verify and beyond, there's one factor they can't handle, which is what's going on at home.
Exactly. And as an employer, you may not necessarily have any way of knowing this. If you're a small size employer, you may know your employees really well. You know that there's foreign nationals there. You know that there are cultural issues there. So you might want to be thinking about, what are you going to do, if this affects your workforce? How will you continue your business? I think it's perhaps a misunderstanding generally in America that the idea that Trump plans to simply remove all these illegal immigrants is a good thing. It's not going to affect me because it doesn't, touch upon me in my life. I think it will. You're talking about anywhere from 12 to 20 million people, depending on whose numbers you want to, look at. That's a big chunk of the, workforce. These are people who are here living and working. And then you add to that the number of other sort of visaed people that he wants to get rid of. So removing that many millions of people from the workforce in one fell swoop is going to have a far-reaching effect, not just on you as an employer, but you as a consumer. What are you buying that's in a reasonable price range right now? Because you've got a lot of these foreign national employees picking your fruit, for example. It's really, I think, going to affect it. And then that's not even taking into consideration the costs for implementing Trump's plans, right? How are you going to physically effectuate the removal of 15 million, say, people from the United States? Who's going to do it? Who's going to find them? Where are you going to put them? Are you going to fly them out? Are you going to bus them out? That's trillions of dollars. So I think there's a lot to think about here that may not really cross people's minds.
Yeah, it's definitely going to reverberate. There's no doubt about it. Look, resources being what they are, you'd almost expect that this will be done in stages, probably. But the point that I'm thinking about is that the wheels may be put in motion for a lot of these things simultaneously, even though the enforcement focuses on one segment versus another in the beginning.
Exactly. It's it's a really big topic. It's a lot to take in. So, what I'm counseling people, individuals and employers, is, stay calm. We'll take it one day at a time. We'll see how things develop. We'll keep an eye on it. I don't encourage anyone to start panicking or start firing their employees or looking at things too closely. But I do recommend, one, I-9 compliance. We know that that's going to be an issue under his term period. It was previously. There's no reason for it not to be. This is the enforcement of existing law. Why would we not go ahead with that, right? So I-9 compliance is definitely a big issue. Employers, it's something you can do. It's something you can fix before the government becomes knocking. I always recommend that employers do this in the context with an attorney as opposed to with an HR type of consulting organization. And the reason for that is privilege. Everything we uncover in the context of an I-9 audit or remediation is going to be covered by privilege, so that if ICE does come knocking in the future, they're not going to necessarily have access to whatever information we may have uncovered, whatever the demographics could look like, whatever mistakes we knew certain employees were making. We just get to repair all of that. And ICE does give us generally full faith and credit for making those corrections before they show up. So I think it's an important thing that we should do. I encourage employers to kind of keep your eyes open, but don't be overly inquisitive about your workforce in terms of anticipating, how all this might affect people leaving or attrition or whatever it may be. I think it's a sticky situation when you're starting to look at people with their different foreign nationalities. And the last thing I really recommend employers to do is disaster planning. So we call it immigration preparation planning. But the Trump administration has been quite vocal about enforcement, and that they are looking for enforcement to be more emphatic. So we think that we're probably going to be moving back towards the era of the raids, which is where the federal government shows up en masse, in riot gear, fully armed, surrounds your building, looks for certain foreign nationals, serves a warrant on the company. It can be a traumatic and frightening experience for clients. I've had clients who have gone through it. We've seen it on TV, we've heard about it, but unless you experience it, it's really unnerving. If you're an employer and you have a manufacturing facility, or you have, a plant in production, who there is going to be ready for this? Who's going to receive that warrant? Who's going to know who to call? Who's going to tell who? What's going to happen? If you don't have a plan in place, it's going to be chaotic. It's going to be difficult. If the federal government has warrants to remove your equipment and your systems, how will you operate the next day? So you need to have a plan in place, just like you would if there was an earthquake or a flood or a fire. We pretty much see those across the board at clients now, but you need something for an unexpected federal visit. That could be any federal agency. The process would be pretty much the same, but we recommend that you have that in place. You've trained your employees. It's in written policy, and at very minimum, they know who to call when the government shows up.
Well, I just want to highlight one thing you said at the end, which is the training. And this comes up a lot in the work we do on the compliance program development side. We tell clients, you got to rehearse this stuff. You got to sit down, and even if you're doing a tabletop exercise, really just go through it and make sure that people actually understand it and can execute on the day that the government shows up. Because to your point, it's going to be a really stressful day.
Exactly. Exactly.
No matter how clean everything is, it's a little unnerving when the federal agents show up.
Absolutely. I mean, how many of us in our daily work lives encounter, armed agents of the federal government? We don't. Even clients I've had who are subject to what we'll call a desktop investigation, which is where they come and serve you with a notice of intent, a notice of inspection. It's still two armed agents that are going to show up and deliver this. And even that is unnerving. So can you imagine having like 10 or 12 agents or 15 agents showing up and surrounding your building? It's way more than just writing out a policy and handing it out. You need to be prepared. So we do support clients in doing that kind of training. And also in the I-9 arena, it's great if we can go in there and fix everything. But if we don't make sure the people who are continuing to execute the I-9s understand, where were the issues? How do I need to do this correctly? And don't receive the right training, your I-9s aren't going to continue to look and feel good. They're going to have liability in them. So I think I-9 training is sort of part of your overall compliance is critical as well. Those companies that have, like the receptionist does the onboarding and the I-9, it's not going to be good for you. You're going to have problems in those records. You're going to have liability.
No matter how diligent your employees are, and for the most part, employees want to do the right thing, but they have to have the training and the skill set to do it.
Exactly. If they don't have the knowledge and the skills, you can't expect them to do it correctly.
Well, to your point about the I-9, you would some people think, I should say, that it's just a form. I can follow the directions, but it ain't easy.
It ain't easy. It's so complicated. There's so many nuances. I always tell my clients, and it's one of my themes in my training, is it's the 3 bears rule. Too much is not good. Too little is not good. It's got to be just right. And most of us think more is always better, right? That's the way we think. And in the I-9 context, that's going to get you into trouble, which so it's counterintuitive in many ways. Yeah. So yeah, training is really critical.
This is great advice, Alka. I really appreciate you sort of breaking it down and making it, sort of logical and makes sense for folks. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking about it.
Oh, that's great. And like I've said a million times, you've been a great addition to the team, and the kind of advice that you're giving the clients is really going to hold them in good shape, especially in this really turbulent time.
Yes. I think it's going to be a tough time, but we'll get through it.
We will, just like everything else.
Just like everything else, one day at a time.
Exactly. Well, this has really been a huge spotlight shining on my friend and colleague, Alka Bahal, who's our corporate immigration services team lead. And this has been Chris Santomassimo, just along for the ride with you today on the Think Factory podcast. We'll see you next time.